Today is Friday, December 6th, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again with my podcast co-host partner, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how are you doing?
I am chilly.
Yes.
We're both mutually complaining about how cold we are. It makes me think we're getting old.
This is like a variety of things.
But otherwise, I am doing just fine. Thank you, Mr. Robinson.
I know what the topic is, of course, today, and I think it's a good one. But what do you want to tell our audience about what we're covering?
Well, it's a very popular musical out these days, making money hand over fist. That's a thing people used to say, Mr. Robinson, making money hand over fist. I don't know why that's the phrase.
We should look into that.
We should look into that. But making a lot of money goes by the name of Wicked, which might seem provocative to our listeners. But I think there's a lot more here to talk about than some might think, and maybe not even some obvious things. So today we're going to talk a bit about that and talk about how it actually is an example of a larger trend that's been going on for some number of years. And we're going to talk about how to keep our biblical heads on straight.
That sounds good.
Thank you, Jake and Julia. In fact, Mr. Robinson and I, during this little break here, were just reminiscing on the fact that Mr. and Mrs. Jake and Julia Boyer did perform special music at services the last time I gave a sermon. So in a moment, I realized before my sermon, it's like, oh, I could say the thing. I could say, but I it's so informal to say that without saying. So I did say thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Boyer, like Mr. Senna did last week.
Most people would wonder at your informality, but our loyal
they
podcast
would have gotten it. That's right.
Like that.
That's right. All right. I mentioned the topic that we're going to talk about the musical Wicked, but it's difficult as we begin talking about it. It's going to seem like, oh yeah, I see what you're saying, but keep in mind there's subtleties involved in all of this. So let us develop the topic a bit. In fact, I have to say our notes are a little different this time around, so it might be a little more rambly than we can be sometimes, but hopefully not. Well, I think our point's pretty clear.
The appearance of Satan as the serpent in the Garden of Eden, he was described as subtle. And
he was. That's
many
right.
Deceptive things are subtle.
It is. And then whenever you think, in fact, sometimes when you're most vulnerable to the subtleties is when you think you've got the bad things nailed down, I would say. So, okay, here we go. I'd like to start off with a passage of scripture because we're going to be talking about a lot of pop culture, frankly, not just this current musical, but a lot of pop culture. And I'd like to make sure you understand where we're coming from biblically. Like, what do we have on our minds? And again, it might seem kind of obvious at first, but I want to use as sort of the basis of what we're talking about, Isaiah chapter 5. In Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 20, we'll start in Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 20. It says there, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight." So starting with that and recognizing, Mr. Robinson, well, before we even get into this specific topic today, doesn't that describe a whole lot of our culture and what's going on in our culture today?
Yeah, and so in some ways this is actually really obvious, yet I feel the need to mention it again, which is, the devil doesn't start with deception by jumping to the extreme. He doesn't try to convince you right off the bat that you're supposed to do X. He leads you down the primrose path. It's a little subtlety after little subtlety until it builds up. And then we do find that you and I would say, because we went to high school in the 80s in Texas, which is fairly conservative, that back then we couldn't have imagined where we that we are where we are, and truly things that have long been held by our civilization as more or less good. And I'm talking about the most generic good and evil. Some of it has been absolutely turned upside down. And it is things that we would consider good, like the sanctity of the family and basics like genders, are now called into question, or you're the problem by even having a family in more extreme situations. Right. So yes, we are definitely in a situation like that.
Okay. Well, in this, there's different ways of doing that. There's different ways in which our society and the devil and our own, at times, deceitful hearts have kind of led us down that primrose path. And I want to take a look at this current popular musical as just one example of a larger trend. And you might think I'm just going to trash it on all sorts of levels, and I'm actually not. There's part of what makes the exchange of evil for good so seductive sometimes is when it's also mixed in with the good, when there's actually worthwhile things that are also being communicated. And because we're going to talk about so much pop culture today, and we have to make plain, none of this is meant to be a recommendation of any of it. We ourselves have not actually seen this movie, nor have I seen the stage musical. And so you might think, well, then you can't comment on it. No, that's garbage. You don't have to live a way of life, or you don't have to, like, for instance, I didn't actually know Hitler personally, but I have looked into some of his life and times, and I think I can say that I'm glad I didn't know him, and I would not have gone for any of his ideology. So, no, we didn't look into all these things, and we don't want this to sound like an endorsement. So you know who we need in a time like this, a hero for the ages, disclaimer guy. So we're going to have disclaimer guy, make sure you understand where we're coming from.
Any discussion that follows should not be considered an endorsement of the subject of that discussion, unless the subject is the Bible. We endorse that big time.
Thank you, disclaimer guy. As always, putting our audience at peace of mind, giving them peace of mind and knowing what we're actually talking about. So we're going to discuss this movie, Wicked, which you might think, oh, it's just because the title alone, it must be bad. Well, that definitely is a suggestion of where we're going with this. But at the same time, and I'll say this is a part of the movie's lesson, if I understand, is that people's stories in great conflicts are often written by the victors. That much of the church's history, Mr. Ogwyn and Ivor Fletcher and those who have kind of worked on putting together the true history of the Church of God have had to work through histories written by our opponents who have cast us as the villains, right? And so they would think we're wicked, right? And so, yeah, that's don't just dismiss it because of the title, but yes, we are going to try to put it in a context. Mr. Robinson and I, neither one of us have seen this movie, even though I'm a musical guy. I've talked about that. Not that I sing well, because I don't, but I like musicals. So this would be normally maybe a draw for me, just so you know, I don't plan on seeing it. So we did ask for ChatGPT to help us by summarizing the movie. And I will say, I may not have seen the movie, but I have read tons about it. And I have also read about the original book, which we'll talk about. And what ChatGPT actually matches what it's written. It matches everything else I've read about the movie pretty well. So here's ChatGPT's summary of the movie. By the way, some of you who might plan on seeing it might consider this spoilers. I have no concern for that whatsoever. I don't care if I'm spoiling this movie for you at all. So keep that in mind. ChatGPT says, the film, I feel like reading it like in a movie trailer voice. The film, a prequel to, but I don't do that as well.
It feels like it should be read that way.
It says the film, a prequel to The Wizard of Oz. And I suppose I shouldn't take for granted that our audience is even familiar with The Wizard of Oz. Maybe I should say it. The Wizard of Oz is a story where a young girl in Kansas named Dorothy, her house is suddenly taken up by a tornado, deposited in this mysterious land called Oz, where she meets a bunch of really short munchkins, and her house lands on a wicked witch.
Literally their names, right?
Yeah, they're called munchkins. Lands on a wicked witch and kills her. And so they're all excited because Dorothy has somehow saved them from the wicked witch. But then the wicked witch's sister, the wicked witch of the West, shows up and says, I'll get you, my pretty. You killed my sister. And she's protected by a good witch named Glinda. And anyway, so in order to get home back to Kansas, she has to travel to meet the Wizard of Oz, this wise and powerful being who runs all of Oz. So she has given some magical, supposedly ruby slippers.
How come Glinda doesn't see through the great and powerful Oz's facade?
Yeah, there's some sort of take on it. I can't remember if it's the channel How It Should Have Ended, where they essentially paint Glinda as the real villain who just manipulated all of this.
Well,
so because at the end, Dorothy ends up learning she could have gone home instantly by clicking her heels together. And it's like, well, why didn't you tell me that at the beginning? It's like, oh, well, then whatever. But on her way, she meets the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodsman, I think he's called, and the Lion, who all have different character flaws and are things they wish were better about themselves. And then she finally makes it to the Wizard, over the course of which journey she ends up killing the Wicked Witch of the West by throwing water on her, and she dissolves. Water's like everywhere. That should
Yeah,
have been really easy
yeah.
for everybody. But anyway,
She should have taken more precautions at the
she
very
should
least.
have. Right, right. Gets through her army of evil flying monkeys. That was always terrified me as a kid. Those flying monkeys,
Yeah, that
mainly
was
because they're
pretty.
people in monkey suits, which is always creepy.
They did a good job making that feel pretty dark.
Oh yeah, yeah. And so, but then she gets to the wizard, and the wizard isn't really a magical being. He's actually some poor old guy who got trapped in Oz or something, and he has used his trickery to make it seem like he's a powerful wizard, but he's really just an old man who's an inventor. And then he wants to get back, I guess, to Kansas also. And he ends up giving the Tin Man, well, not really. The Tin Man already has a heart. He shows him, and the lion's already courageous, even though he's cowardly. And the Scarecrow already is smart. And so he helps them realize that, but pretends like he's giving it to him, I guess. And then he ends up leaving to go back to Kansas. But then Dorothy somehow misses the balloon, and the good
Toto
witch
jumps out of the basket.
Oh, is that what happens? Oh man, I don't even remember that. She has a dog named Toto. I forgot, because the witch says, "I'm going to get your dog too." And then, and then the good witch tells her, "Oh, you just had to click your heels together all this time. With your slippers." Then she finds herself back in Kansas with her family that she was upset with, and you wonder, was it all a dream? Okay, that's the old story of the Wizard of Oz, told very poorly. So here is the prequel to the Wizard of Oz, which is what Wicked is. And I would say it's actually what you find out eventually when you watch part 2 as well, given what the book and the stage musical is. It's actually not just that. It's not just a prequel. It's as if that was all, if you will, like a propaganda story. Like that story is not the real thing that happened. And the musicals and the book, I'll keep mentioning the book. Please never get the book. I'll talk about that in a minute. Here's the story of this movie, which is only part 1 of 2. So, the film, a prequel to The Wizard of Oz, explores the friendship between Elphaba, the future wicked witch of the West, and Glinda, the good witch, again, their terms, during their time at Shiz University. Despite their differences, they bond deeply until Elphaba discovers the wizard's oppressive regime and rebels, becoming labeled as, quote, wicked. That's part of the wizard's propaganda campaign against her, making everybody think her actions because she's really evil and wicked. Glinda chooses ambition over friendship, aligning with the wizard. So notice the good witch has actually got this bad quality. The story examines themes of prejudice, power, and morality, setting the stage for part 2. Now, that was its more condensed summary. It gave me a longer summary earlier, and I like its details when it gave me a longer summary. In the longer summary, it said the film delves into themes of prejudice, the nature of evil, and the consequences of personal choices. All right. Well, those are good themes to explore, I would say. And so I asked it to explain, okay, well, how do you think it's exploring each of these things? Well, it's like for prejudice, it explains that Elphaba is green. If you remember the old Wizard of Oz, she was green. And that symbolizes her outsider status. And so she's kind of discriminated at an early age because she's green. And that mirrors societal biases against people who seem different. That also in the movie, there's these talking animals, like the animals are sentient, so they all talk. And the wizard is oppressing them with the system he has in place. And that's also a part of prejudice. As for the nature of evil, we'll be returning to these if Mr. Robinson doesn't mind. But I like its summary here. It says that the movie questions what defines someone as evil. Elphaba is labeled wicked for defying the wizard and is portrayed rather as actually being compassionate and principled, whereas the seemingly benevolent wizard is revealed to be manipulative and oppressive. This theme challenges black and white morality, ChatGPT says, suggesting that evil is often a matter of perspective. We'll definitely come back to that.
Yeah.
And then point 3, consequences of personal choices. The divergent paths of Elphaba and Glinda highlight the ripple effects of their decisions. Elphaba's moral stand isolates her but aligns her with her values, while Glinda's pursuit of status compromises her integrity and strains their friendship. The film emphasizes that choices, even well-intentioned ones, can lead to unintended consequences and define one's legacy. Okay, those things. There's a lot of not bad stuff in that, Mr. Robinson, right? There's a lot of stuff that there's nothing wrong with teaching, I would think. Is God concerned about our moral character versus our appearance? Well,
Yes.
He's concerned with our moral character, right? Also, it is true that your personal choices end up affecting your legacy and how people think of you. So that's definitely a good point. But it all comes down to that second point, the nature of evil. To me, breaking up what it said in 3 parts, it says the movie questions what defines someone as evil. Oh, well, does it really question that? Well, then it says how. It says Elphaba is labeled as wicked for defying the wizard, but she's portrayed as compassionate and principled, versus the wizard is revealed to be manipulative and oppressive. Well, Mr. Robinson, I don't know anyone who thinks that being compassionate and principled is bad versus manipulative and oppressive. Who thinks that's actually good?
Right.
That's not really questioning the nature of evil. We all already agree that those things are kind of good and bad. But still, I do agree with its statement that it's trying to challenge black and white morality, suggesting that evil is often a matter of perspective. It's not really. It's borrowing absolute standards to cause us to think differently about heroes and villains that our culture has given us in the past. But it's not actually challenging our thought of what's actual wrong. We don't think oppression is good. We think oppression is bad. But it is still messing with us in some way because it is wanting us broadly to question those things.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about the book, and Mr. Robinson, I think you'll assure me also, you haven't read the book.
No, I didn't even know there was a book.
Yeah.
Maybe somewhere in my subconscious, I maybe knew there was a musical about it, and that's as far as we know. Now, but by the way, let me agree with you. These days, with especially like you had the plot summary there,
Yeah.
and then I think you and I watched the same one. We watched a review of the movie. Like you could get a pretty good feel for what the movie's trying to get across without actually watching it.
Yeah, you think so, right?
Yeah.
I feel like some people who want to say, hey, you can't critique something unless you've actually sat and watched it. I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I think that part of discernment is being able to realize, no, I know enough to know I don't want to watch that, right? It's like saying you can't call something bad until you've done it. No, that's why we have principles. That's why we have guidelines to help us understand what not to participate in.
Now, so it's one of the things that's emerging, at least for me, is it's pretty key to know whether or not The Wizard of Oz is propaganda. Because if The Wizard of Oz is not propaganda and actually happened, then the best measure of is somebody wicked or not is by their pattern of behavior. And the wicked witch that we see in The Wizard of Oz is genuinely a wicked and evil person.
Right.
Using her minions and clearly has some level of tyranny, even with her own followers, and trying to wipe out Dorothy and even her little dog.
Right.
What is it?
Right. Toto.
I'll get your little dog.
Yeah.
I'll get you and your dog.
And I'll get your and your little dog too. I can't remember exactly. Yeah.
So
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too. That's what she says.
So the first thing, and I might be jumping in a little too far. My first thought about all this. So how do we evaluate this? And I know we'll get more into the idea of, wicked's kind of a matter of what's wicked is a matter of perspective and how you define it. But as a Christian and being generally 1 to 10 towards black and white, you can paint all kinds of reasons why this person is not actually a bad person, except that we can see the results and the consequences of their actions and their decisions. And what I see in The Wizard of Oz is a wicked witch who has earned that title properly by her conduct.
Right. And part of what's interesting about the musical, when you know more details, and it's all the plainer when you look at their source material, is they're trying to take a look at good and evil through a very particular moral lens. And there's aspects to the characters that we would actually see, oh wait, that's actually a character flaw. There's this and that is actually a part of the moral universe of the creators, where they don't even worry about such things. They're focused on a very finite list of good and evil, and even sin. It's got a Freudian slip, but even then, they're wanting you to embrace the good and reject the evil, but without necessarily recognizing that these are only a small part of a larger picture where you're actually accepting more than you think.
Yes.
But they give you the obvious thing that you should accept and the obvious thing that you should reject. But if you really examine it carefully, and that's going to be one of our themes in this, you're actually rejecting a much broader picture and accepting a much broader picture. And they use the obvious as vehicles for actually the less obvious. Now, it's far clearer if you look at the source material. And I do remember back in the mid to late 90s, I think, when this book came out, and this movie is based on a stage musical. The stage musical itself was based on a book. I've written the fella's name somewhere. I can't recall his name, but
so and is what you're part of what you're saying and about to go into more detail in is by the time you get to the movie, it's more subtle, the agenda.
I would say they've actually, how do I put it? Right. Okay, let's actually take a look at the book, and then maybe that'll help communicate, because you asked the right question. The book, and I want to say, hopefully I've got it written down later. I think his name is Gregory Maguire, something like that. But the name of the book was it was Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West. And I'm not saying that so you can go look up the book. The book is garbage. Please don't go read the book.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to understand it as a source material.
Gregory Maguire.
That is it? Okay, great. Thank you. The book is definitely darker. It is much darker than the made for public consumption play and movie. For instance, it's gory and graphic in places. The love interest in the movie, in the stage musical, in the actual book, he ends up being brutally tortured to death. And also was an adulterer, as we'll find out, because in the movie he's just a love interest. In that, he actually has a family and a wife that he abandons, essentially for the sake of his adulterous partner, which is our heroine, the future Wicked Witch of the West.
Okay.
Also, she herself is kind of depicted as an atheist a bit. Kind of like, if you really read between the lines, as kind of an atheist versus her family and others, which are kind of religious. And it's her lack of that faith that everybody has that is kind of painted as a source of conflict and yet a source of strength for her. Also, the book has a lot of heavy sexuality and just straight up perversion. I'm not going to go into detail beyond mentioning that I've already mentioned there's adultery and fornication. There's a sense of homosexuality. And then I wish the list stopped there, but I'm definitely not going to go into any more detail than that. But it's actually explicit and graphic. And I think of this movie coming out, and I think of the people excited about the songs. I can already imagine the sing-alongs they'll have, like they did with Greatest Showman and other things. And then people thinking, oh, there's a book, and seeing young people want to read the book. And the book is way more explicit than, honestly, anybody should be reading, let alone any young people.
Well, and not to belabor this point, but the music is actually pretty key. Like Frozen, I would say, is another example of using music to kind of sell an idea that's definitely different than the traditional family values.
Yeah, like the equivalent of, how many little girls were singing "Let It Go," at a certain pace. But then imagine the source material for Frozen is some explicit, violent, gory, book. Okay, well, given that, and then finally, Elphaba, and this will correspond to the musical as well. She's kind of someone who's trying to resist this evil with the wizard, but in the book, it's far plainer that her actions start to become. I don't think it's so much exaggeration to say terrorist-like. But then the question is, but it's in the right cause, right? It's a brutal dictatorship that the wizard has. Isn't it right to do these kinds of things? Or is it right because everyone suffers? There's collateral damage. So the book is very much still in the spirit of the musicals because it's trying to get you to question, well, is she really wicked? Isn't that an unfair label for this complex human being who's been shaped by all the things around her? In fact, isn't she in many ways good, trying to save lives and save the free speech of these animals? Well, there's an active desire to fuzzy the lines with these things. So as we get into the broader trend that this is related to, I just want to highlight to everybody, think of that source material and how there's no way you should not be reading that. Let me just say flat out, you shouldn't read that. There's better things to spend our time reading. And yet the movie Wicked is being given to us as something that's teaching good lessons, like don't reject people just because they're different, and don't be comfortable with terrible injustices that are given towards other people, and don't judge other people inappropriately, and how morality does matter, and how people can do good things and be painted as bad, but that doesn't mean that they themselves are bad. Those are worthwhile lessons. But at the same time, what is the overall, what is the broader message that is being communicated in each case? Think about that. If the source material is so abhorrent in its morality, where sexual morality is just absolutely laughed in the face of, other things that I don't want to get into, why would anyone read that book and think, hey, I could really adapt this into a wonderful tale that I can use to communicate morality to people? And then I am not trying to pick on individuals. People come from different backgrounds. It is a blessing to know the truth. To our young teens and young adults who are listening, I hope that you thank God every day. And if you don't, then I hope you begin to thank him that you know the things you do. But let me point to, as an example, the stars of the particular movie. The woman who is playing the future Wicked Witch of the West is a bisexual who's currently in a homosexual relationship, where the woman she's in a relationship with was actually, quote unquote, married to a woman earlier. And then that relationship, I don't know if it broke apart because of this one or whatever the case is. She's known for her excessive piercings in her nose and her ears. I don't know. Sometimes I see it and I hope it's really just one or two piercings, and maybe it just looks like 8 or 9, but it's just so many, which, whatever you might think about different piercings, the fact is definitely there's a line where it's like, this is God's image that I'm messing with, right? That does mean something. There's a certain point where you have to understand what you have to ask, what culture are you headed towards with that?
And you're not sure which piercing to look at.
Yes, exactly right. And then when it comes to the future good witch, in this case, Glinda, being played by Ariana Grande, very popular performer, and yet when you think popular, there's no way we could even read some of the stuff we came across. But the lyrics of some of her songs, it's not necessarily the stuff that's going to get top 10 play, but some of her music is straight up raunchy and vulgar.
So there's an internet radio station I listen to, and the guy's an old radio guy. So like he's pretty old, and he does one unique thing, and it's called it's listener supported. So he doesn't have commercials because you're supposed to, pledge a certain amount of money. Okay. Anyway, he sent out an email this week talking about his main playlist and talking about how he was changing it. And one of the things was he commented on the explosion of profanity in contemporary music.
Really?
Yeah. He said in the past it was pretty easy to avoid, and his ex-wife was sensitive to it, so he's pretty careful about steering clear of it. He says now there's so much of it, it's difficult to avoid, and so now he's had to pick his battles. If he left out every single song that had some profanity in it,
he wouldn't have any.
He wouldn't have any music practically.
Wow.
So he had to draw the line on certain words that we won't even mention here that you can imagine, and not play songs that we're playing that. But like, it's interesting that even a very, very secular man, whose business is music, it commented on just how much language there is.
You see, I there's a part of me that I take for granted in a way that I shouldn't, that if someone is really popular, like top of the heap popular, well, that surely they aren't all that vulgar. How could you be as famous and popular as that person, and with such a broad audience? And then when I actually dove into this young woman's work and realized, wow, that is straight up vulgar. Yep. If I did have a daughter or son who wanted to listen to that music, I would say absolutely not.
I don't remember. It was probably for the best, the artist or the song. But this was about a year ago, and we were listening to the song in our house. We often have music playing in the background, and Maddie wasn't married yet, and so the girls were in there, and they suggested some song to me. This sounds like I'm throwing them under the bus. And it didn't have the explicit note that Apple did. All our music is from Apple. And so it marks, Apple, like, I don't know if Spotify does it or not, but it'll mark a song. I have a little E in the title, and you'll know it's explicit. Well, we're listening to the song, and a very clear word came out that there was not ambiguous at all. And I turned to one of my daughters and I said, wow, I thought this was supposed to be the clean version. And they had to inform me the Apple's new policy is if it only has one bad word in it, it's no longer considered explicit.
Always just creeps, keeps creeping. Yeah, I actually came across, I came across an article that was discussing this particular performer's music, and that's all they highlighted was several songs on one album, and it was, even if she hadn't used vulgar language, just the mere thing things she was singing about were absolutely
Yeah.
vulgar, and
Right.
yet the vulgar language don't. So here's my point with this before we talk to the broader trend and highlight how this ties in with that concept in Isaiah chapter 5. Why is it that we have a moral? No one's perfect. I would definitely say, I hope you don't take this personally, Mr. Robinson, the two people sitting making this podcast together. Nobody's perfect. But that said, here are two individuals going on press tours, and clearly, I've seen pictures of them on press tours kind of holding hands, not in a romantic way, just like kind of being friends. And they're going, here's this wonderful story of morality, but yet, what do they picture themselves? Well, I would dare say that the people who are selling this to you as, please listen to our moral story so you can learn things and grow in your moral stances, all these other things they're fine with. They actually think some of that is probably praiseworthy. Like, oh, and this young woman, what an example she sets for owning her sexuality and all this. That's their value system. And we need to be mindful of the fact that if someone is trying to sell us a moral story, their own personal value system should be a red flag if it's not good, because that is one way that's something that might indicate what are the more subtle things they hope to communicate, where the overt messages are great. Hey, don't be prejudiced. That's a good thing to say. But what is it they're wanting you to actually not be, quote unquote, prejudiced about? Often it's the immoral things that they want to slip and make a broader part of life. Well, it's a broader scope than this, and that's what we'd like to actually talk about in terms of what we see with other movies. And this did resonate with you, right, Mr.
Yeah.
Robinson? We talked about this topic.
No, I was actually going to comment and say, we both come up with ideas, but lately you've had a slew of podcast ideas, and you were running this one past me, and kind of what your thoughts were. And one of the reasons this topic resonated with me is I agree with the one thing where I think you're headed, which is one of the things I had noticed, which was this trend of movies. I think mostly movies that took like for instance, Maleficent is a good example.
A Disney movie, right?
Yeah, clearly the bad guy, if you will.
Well, she was the bad guy in Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah,
evil woman. Okay, right.
But now here's this new movie that actually she's misunderstood. she wasn't a megalomaniacal murderer. She just was misunderstood, and actually she had good heart of gold. A witch was she a witch? No, she was the the queen. But she was like
an evil, a witchy kind of queen.
Yeah.
She must have some magical powers because she turns into a dragon at the end, and she's opposed by the good little fairies. I barely remember Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah.
But
No, I realize now that I'm struggling with it a little as well. But anyway, and then the Joker. Another one.
More recent.
Yeah. I don't think it's on your list, but like the Penguin, which apparently didn't do very well from what I understand.
Oh, streaming series, right? Yeah, the Batman villain Penguin, right?
I see. This will make. I'm going to make this comment anyway. This is not actually me taking like a hard moral stance in the way that you might think. Like, oh yeah, we're thinking biblically, so of course. No, I always liked very clear cut good guys and bad guys, and I never enjoyed this idea that no, the bad guy's just actually misunderstood, and it's nuanced, and if you just understood where he was coming from and all that kind of stuff.
And that's what I think like Maleficent and such do. They kind of recast these villain characters as if you understood the context, if you understood that really her actions were simply a reaction to these other kinds of things, you would think so differently. Joker is, I think, a good example. Again, a movie that I am not going to see, and not the sequel one recently that did so poorly.
No, the first one.
But going back to 2019 or so, the Warner Brothers Joker that took the Batman villain, who is a psychopath, and creates a sympathetic character for him to a certain extent that they say that the sequel movie that did so poorly recently, that part of it was kind of made to in reaction to the fact that how many people liked the Joker in the first movie. They actually sympathized with him, as a character, and felt like, I understand where he's coming from, right? Like society, this is what it does to you. It's like, well, the moment you put off any blame for your terrible choices on society, that's a dangerous moral point. But it's like we're trying to rehabilitate these villains, but without actually rehabilitating them, not actually causing them to repent of their past actions. Think of the Cruella one. You mentioned the Maleficent. I think of Cruella, the one that takes the villain from the
Yep.
101 Dalmatians. And now we've got an origin story for her, which is far more sympathetic. Not just someone who wants to kill a bunch of puppies so she can, make some clothes, but someone that, you know where she's coming from now. It's very different.
Well, there was even the TV series some time ago that was Lucifer, and
I forgot about that.
And here, he's not such a bad guy. He's kind of funny and witty, and you might want to hang out with him. He's just misunderstood. I think it's a very common normalization of evil is just, it's just misunderstood. And there are reasons why it's this way. One other thing I want to comment about the Joker before we go on.
Sure.
It kind of reminds me of one of these crime victim shows that got real popular, and it was something like, Criminal Minds Special Victims Unit, and then the tagline was, I may be mixing these together, get inside the mind of a killer.
Oh yeah, that was that show was Criminal Minds, I think, because I thought that was terrible.
One might be surprised as to the main reason I wouldn't watch something like the Joker is from that right there. I don't want to watch something where the protagonist is a psychopath and we're on a journey with him.
Right. Why in the world would you want to follow the mind of such a person? It's perverse and it's corrupting.
Yes.
And I think that's actually what they want.
Yeah.
I think deep down, they'd like you to be a little corrupted from that.
Yeah. And even if somebody doesn't have, like, say you're the director and you're like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to normalize evil. And here's how I'm going to do it. But very flawed men out there do have their problems, and everybody seeks to justify themselves. And so a movie that's like, hey, we're all a little misunderstood out there.
And even if it's only profit motive, even if it's like, hey, I'll make a bunch of money because people will find this intriguing. There's a danger to not caring about what people find intriguing because you end up reinforcing elements in the society when you do that. And that's kind of what I think they risk doing with Joker.
Yes.
Is that even if they realize, hey, this will be an intriguing story, we can make a lot of money off of this, but then you end up reinforcing those people that feel like, yeah, I've got an excuse for the evil that I feel or the sometimes murderous thoughts that I might have. Versus there's there was two others I did want to mention because I can't say they're popular now. In fact, at least in one case, they're definitely not. But I would say, for instance, Amazon's current Rings of Power series on its second season, there are certain elements of that where you have, say, J.R. Tolkien, who tried to make clear good guys and bad guys, not necessarily perfect people, even flawed good guys, right? And even maybe in something, regardless, good guys and bad guys, versus now you have Amazon taking that and now we see, the orcs are family, men or whatever, or you see a little bit of watering down of some of that stark stuff that you just mentioned a while ago, like the good guys. You see a lot of politics at play. That's kind of, now don't get me wrong, can be worthwhile lessons from that, but again, it's a matter of what's the full package of what you're trying to teach. I think a better example, and I did not watch this series, and that is Marvel's The Acolyte that came out with Disney Plus, where it's supposed to be some story that takes place a long time ago in the Star Wars universe, and it has the Sith and the Jedi, but totally switches things around.
No, I would like to hear you comment about it a little bit more. Would you agree? Well, at least this is what it seems like to me. That was actually kind of almost in some ways the climax, or at the very least a continuation of a long-running trend to increasingly question whether or not the Jedi were actually good guys or not.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, and again, it's more reading about it than watching, because I never felt a draw, and hope people would take that to mean something, that I didn't even want to watch it. George Lucas he wanted good guys and bad guys. He felt that actually, if you go into when he originally created the original six movies, it didn't have anything to do with the other three. He felt that the world needed more stories with clear good guys and clear bad guys that taught, good and evil. And even though he may have gotten some of good and evil wrong, still the intention, there can be appreciated. But yes, exactly that. You have stories like The Acolyte that takes the Sith, which were supposed to be obvious bad guys, and kind of makes them more sympathetic, even makes it more of an appeal to a certain extent, but then takes the Jedi, which were supposed to, even if they were flawed, and Lucas did write them as flawed good guys, especially when you look at the prequels, they were still good guys, but no, actually kind of paints them as bad guys, like they have their own political corruption. They have their own kind of. It's like we can't have just heroes and villains anymore. Everybody has to be either corrupted more if they're good guys or raised up if they're bad guys, such that everything overall, it's like the median becomes generally debased.
Okay, so I used to roll my eyes when I was the age of our target audience over the trends on music, movie, and subtle things even within TV shows. I know in this day and age, the idea of the cowboys and the Indians is controversial, but
like the old shows, old westerns,
the old shows, yeah. But in TV shows, as TV really began to like hit its stride and became super popular, and more Americans and others started having TVs, the good guys wore white and the bad guys wore black. And then over time, there started to be good guys that wore black because it was just kind of cooler. And so, I was like, yeah, oh, sure. They're just trying to make that, confuse villains and heroes. And, looking at it now, 30, 35 years later, I think there might have been something to that. There's been an attempt to mix up, whether consciously or not. We got to remember that Satan's the prince of the power of the air, and he has influence over our civilization. And God doesn't deny that at all, that he has a lot of influence over what's going on, especially in pop culture. And that there's been an attempt to blur the lines between the good guys and the bad guys for a long time in our entertainment and in our media.
Yeah, it definitely would be a broader look, but we could do that where we started to replace heroes with anti-heroes. We started to replace heroes with guys who really in a lot of ways wouldn't be the hero, and yet for our story they are. It's funny you talk about using black and white as a key in terms of clothing and things like that, because I think a good example of how to do some of this, again, not saying it's perfect, and you might even think that this is the same, but it's not. I would say an example of trying to do it and keep things proper would be what George Lucas did with Star Wars. Not trying to do what Isaiah 5 condemns, calling good evil and evil good. No, actually quite the opposite. Yes, the stormtroopers, had white uniforms, but Darth Vader was dressed in black. The Emperor, when you meet him, is dressed in black. What do you see Luke when you first meet him as innocent farm boy on Tatooine? He's wearing white. In fact, the princess also wearing white, Princess Leia, but the one character that was a bit morally in between and has an arc where he's kind of all about the money, but then comes through in the end is Han Solo. What does his costume look like? It's a white shirt, black vest, right? So you look at that. George Lucas was not a dummy. He loved these kind of archetypes that were sort of basic. Now, what does happen? Eventually, you get to Return of the Jedi. You've learned that. Now, it's also interesting when Luke goes to save the day. He's wearing
black.
Well, actually, in the middle movie, I was thinking he's wearing kind of tan. It's a beige.
Well,
but yes, in
Return of the
Jedi, because it's meant to cause you to question. You've learned his dad is Darth Vader. Sorry for the spoiler, everybody, but his dad was Darth Vader. And sure enough, even the first time you see him, he's doing actions kind of like his dad did, and yet he's still in the hero role, and it's supposed to cause you concern. Is he going down that path? He said he wanted to be like his father in the first movie, and now he's starting to act like his father. And so you're starting to worry because the film is going to climax with him having the temptation of, do I go ahead and embrace all this strength and power and the rest? But he was doing something very particular. But going back to Darth Vader, why is that? Why is, in that sense, that story, I'm not endorsing it, I'm not saying go out and see it, but what's different between that and the movies we're talking about when it comes to Isaiah chapter 5 and calling good evil and evil good? Because even though the story ends up with Darth Vader being redeemed, quote unquote, it's not like these. Nowhere is George Lucas trying to say, all the murder and the killing that Darth Vader did, it was really good. He really was actually a good guy. No, he becomes good in the end. He dies a good guy, but because he repents, because he changes, because he rejects all of the villainy that he did and recognizes at the end that it was wrong, throws the Emperor down the big kind of tower tunnel thing, and sacrifices himself to save his son, recognizing that it was all a mistake. I would even say, for instance, in more modern terms, you have like Marvel did the streaming series on Loki, the bad guy from some of their movies. Well, again, is that just them trying to take a bad guy and make his villainy good, Well, no, actually, if you look at that overall arc over there, they have him essentially repenting, where he's changing, and he discovers he actually wants to help and sacrifice, and if anything, looks back at some of what he did in the past with regret, recognizing those things were wrong. If you want to go to more humorous stuff, the old cartoon Megamind. I can't tell you how many times I heard Megamind. I must have heard it like 5 times before I ever saw it, because the kids, we knew the movie, we were okay with it, just so you know, we were okay with it. But our kids had watched it in the car, and I couldn't actually hear it, but my wife had actually seen it. But when we actually did see it, it matched everything we expected. But in that one, the theme is you have a villain. He's kind of a comical villain, but in the end, he doesn't want to be a bad guy. It's not like he embraces somehow that, oh yeah, villain, at least if I remember it well. No, he even tells like his little minion there, maybe I don't want to be bad. Maybe I want to be good. He comes to learn that he needs to change, and he wants to be one of the good guys instead. That's not the trend that we're talking about. I'm all for a redemption story. Christ died for me so that I could be redeemed, not so that it would turn my villainous sins of the past good, but so that I could grow beyond them. I could recognize them for evil, and I could turn to what's good. That's a great story. There's nothing wrong with an approach like that. We might do it poorly, but that's a good approach. But that's not what these movies are. This isn't the Wicked Witch of the West who realizes, I was a bad guy, but now I want to be a good guy. That's not in these other stories like Cruella, etc., realizing, you know what? It's wrong to be those things. I want to become a good person and embrace real morality.
The Darth Vader redemption arc is questionable.
Oh, it's not complete. Don't get me wrong.
I mean, I know that Luke said, I feel good in you. It's just we're not seeing that behavior manifested in any way.
That's right.
And I don't think a deathbed confession just absolves himself as literally the murderous path that he went on for his
how does
life.
that pay a price?
Yeah.
That's part of what the glory of Christ is his sacrifice is big enough. But for Vader, he murdered and slaughtered as a tyrant for decades, but in the end or at least 2 decades. But then it's like, I made a mistake, and I stopped one bad guy, saved my son, and then he gets to be in Jedi heaven, quote unquote.
Well,
it's like, wait a minute, how does that work?
Well, we'll probably move on from this after this, but we've got to mention what I think is the best redemption arc of all time, which was Zuko on The Last Airbender.
That actually is. But again, you have a guy who, in that, for those familiar with it, he repents. Yeah. He decides that he
very clear repentance. Very actively chooses to reject his past mission, what he was trying to achieve in life, and goes the opposite way against it and supports what, frankly, it really is literally the opposite of what he was trying to do in the beginning of the series.
Right. And again, none of this is an endorsement of any of these things. In fact, I think Netflix is doing a live adaptation of some of that, and I hear parts of that are garbage. But no, I think there's a wonderful thing to a story where someone who was bad becomes good and realizes the error of their ways. But that's not the trend that we're seeing in entertainment today. What we're seeing, to go back to the scriptures, is far more what we read in Isaiah chapter 5, starting, and I'd like to go back there, but I want to start a little bit earlier this time. Isaiah 5 and verse 18, where it says, "Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of vanity, and sin as if with a cart rope." Here's people that are pulling iniquity toward themselves. And I love the phrase cords of vanity, because a lot of the people crafting these stories for us and for our children, they're driven by an addiction to their own sense of right and wrong and what they think should be honored in the world and what they think. And, you think this person's a villain. In fact, I think going back to The Acolyte, when I saw interviews about that Star Wars show, and they were asking the creator, they were asking some of the stars, well, which side are you, the light side or the dark side, like you as a person? Mm-hmm. And a lot of them straight up saying, I think actually I'd be dark side. They're literally admitting.
Right.
And if you go back to the creation of those stories, George Lucas was like, well, no, I did that to picture selfishness, the dark side, versus selflessness, the light side. So you have people that are driven by their own personal philosophies, what they think actually matters in morality versus anything that what God thinks. Forget what God thinks. This is what we think. And they're drawing iniquity toward themselves with these cords woven of their own vanity. I think I like that picture.
I could be rusty on this, but isn't the rest of the imagery, or is it maybe a couple chapters earlier there in Isaiah? It's such an amazing illustration of what's going on. Another component of it is, despite suffering great consequences and suffering from their sins and their actions, they will not let go of it, and they continue to pull it behind them.
Oh, they don't. And it's so ridiculous because it ends up being tied in idol worship. And he highlights to them so frequently in Isaiah, why are you worshiping an idol? It makes no sense. It's bringing you nothing but doom and destruction. Come to the one that can actually save you. And that's kind of what you see here. The same people that are trying to teach us morality in stories like Wicked and in all these other stories, it's their morality that is helping to shape all the things. It's why families are deteriorating, right? It's all of these things that are going terrible that we understand from a biblical perspective are the real causes of our society falling apart. Why are we allowing these people to continue to moralize to us and to actually be our teachers of right and wrong?
Yeah. I think that's one of the true end time lessons for, if I was ever going to take Israel, the modern descendants of Israel as a nation, and think what lesson is there for us all collectively, it will be this seemingly comfortable. Well, it is comfortable. We live a comfortable life. We have many.
I certainly do.
Yeah.
My hands and feet are cold right now, like we talked about, but very comfortable life.
But we pay a great price as a nation for the way we are living our lives right now. And I mean, this is the broadest way. Those of us in the church have repented and we walk a different walk, but as a nation, we do, the disintegration of the family, many lament it, but some think this is a great thing, and we freed ourselves from the shackles. And despite the mounting evidence of tremendous consequences we suffer and great suffering, we just continue pulling that cart right behind us.
Oh yeah, just like it describes. Then we get to the verses like in 20 and 21, which we read earlier. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. And woe, to a certain extent, means punishment is coming, but also, frankly, the consequences you generate in your life and your spiritual life by doing that. So woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. And you have these individuals crafting these stories, and they believe they know what's right and wrong. They truly are convicted of that, and they're trying to sell those things to us. But here's what among the elements of caution we want to add about the stories you may be allowing yourself to digest, which, please don't just do that mindlessly, is that, again, they'll offer things that are obvious, like you shouldn't discriminate against people just because they look different than you. You shouldn't sacrifice what's right and wrong just for the sake of social standing. Well, those things are obvious. But what is the larger package of what they're doing? Because Satan doesn't transform himself into an angel of light by just telling you, hey, drink poison, it's delicious. Or, hey, why don't you go do a murder? It's really fun. No, he takes things, it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not just the pure evil that gets you, it's how it's mixed in with good. And so you're taken in by the good you hear, but then you end up taking things along with it. To me, there's a beautiful subtlety in what Jesus says in Luke chapter 11. In Luke chapter 11, and he's talking about light and darkness and being careful, in terms of how you handle things and how you look at things. And there's this one statement he makes in Luke 11 and verse 35 that, to me, there's a beautiful subtlety to it. He says, therefore, take heed that the light which is in you is not darkness. And I think that's an important warning, especially in your youth, when you're making some decisions that are going to last, that are going to impact you for the rest of your life, to recognize that you might think there's light, you think there's goodness in something. Christ is saying, be careful about that. Make sure that that thing you think is light isn't actually
Right.
darkness instead,
Yeah.
because it's not always obvious.
Yeah. No, I'd never read that before. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I read it, but
No, same thing. Sometimes I'll read a verse and it just it hits different later, right? It sinks in differently.
Right. No,
Well,
that's really good.
Do you want to aim at starting to wrap up?
Yeah.
But takeaway
That
things?
sounds good.
Okay. So some things I thought would be worthwhile to take away from this. One point would be, we say this a lot, I know, but don't just embrace what the world offers you, even when it feels like what you're being sold is a moral take of good versus evil.
In fact, that might even be a sign to be even more suspicious of the messaging.
Oh, that's an excellent observation, Mr. Robinson. That's very good.
That's my job.
Yeah, it's right. Even if it seems obvious, that might be more of a warning sign. It's exactly right. All right. Next, I would say, ask yourself, what are the more subtle things they're trying to get me to accept in this story?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I'll go back to the story Wicked. When you look at the story, what they're doing, you have the Oz character has got this cruel. He's got this systemically oppressive system. He is the government. He's controlling everything, and you're standing up against the oppression. Well, okay, that might be fine for just by what it is, but then take a look at those same people and what they see as oppressive in our world today.
Right.
They're trying to push back against the stifling structure of the family, the stifling of anyone telling me what to do and not letting me live my authentic self.
The patriarchal tyranny.
Exactly. And so that's what's on their minds. They're wanting to push back against those kinds of things. So that's the subtle message. And they're not going to say those things necessarily blatantly. They might in some cases. But that will be present more subtly in the message. So you're taking in a message that seems blatantly stand up for what's right. Like God wants to honor those who are oppressed. And he says hard things about the oppressor. But then it's in the subtle cues around that, what they're really trying to say, what they think of as oppressive, etc. So ask yourself, what are the more subtle things that the creators of some story are trying to get across to me in a story?
Well, like we mentioned earlier, in the podcast, in this case, one of them is to accept the idea that villains might just actually be misunderstood.
Right, and the thing is, that's what's so I say devilish about it, is that it is true. Sometimes villains are misunderstood. Like we have the example of the church in history. Sometimes they're painted as the villains by, say, the Roman Catholic Church in the past, when actually they weren't the villains of the story. They were people trying to obey Christ. But these individuals putting these stories together, that's not the case. Actually, they want you to accept some things that are truly evil as good.
I think it's kind of like the Mos Eisley spaceport on Tatooine. Obi-Wan wisely said it was a wretched hive of scum and villainy. But what if it's just some misunderstood criminals? What if you just got to know them a little bit better and they had reasons why they were villainous?
If you just sat down with a glass of blue milk with some of these guys, you'd recognize they're really decent fellas. Okay, the last couple of takeaway things. Ask yourself also, who is it who's seeking to teach me with this story? And what is it that they believe? Because what they believe might find its way into the tale.
I think a great example, since you already mentioned it, and what a great point is the acolyte. The director, and to a lesser degree the protagonist, the main star, were pretty open about what they were trying to do. They did have an agenda, and they are trying to make you have a different way of thinking. I think just more broadly expressed by the what's good is evil. What's good is evil, and what's evil is good. Because that was a part of it, to take the guys that were always the good guys and make them seem like actually the bad guys, and then the pagan coven witches were actually the good people.
Right. Which actually kind of makes me think. Some of us, you might think, well, you haven't even talked about if these things are promoting sorcery or not, or like in the Acolyte, like you had a whole coven of witches, and the main character has two mommies. The way you look at it, that's actually. We haven't talked about some of the more blatant things because we're trying to talk about the more subtle influences these things kind of bring to the table. Okay, the last takeaway, at least that I thought of, was, okay, that's fine. So what do you do that's kind of proactive? Well, it's not going to differ from what we normally say is it is especially in your youth, like it says in Ecclesiastes, and like we read in one of our psalms, one of our hymns that we read that we sing in church. Now is the time to take the time to ground yourselves in the real truth about what is right and what is wrong. John 17:17, Jesus Christ in prayer to his Father says, "Your word is truth." That never gets old. Also, he says in the same chapter in verse 3, he says, "This is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you've sent, your Son." Those things don't get old. You are not wasting time, dear younger listeners, spending portions of your life reading God's word, praying to him, asking him to help you see what is actually good and what is truly real in the world. Because if you don't have a godly standard of what's right and wrong, if you don't understand what his mind is on things, then when you are exposed to the things of the world, you're just defenseless and vulnerable. So you'll start taking something in that's obviously good, and you won't realize the other things that are slipping in because you haven't spent that time getting to know the mind of God to have revealed for you those things that truly are good. So it's worth the time to actually do that. You don't want to wade into this world and its morality without seeking the guidance of God the Father and Jesus Christ in the manner they seek to provide it to you. Because if you fail to do that, then before you know it, you end up growing up calling the wicked good and the good wicked.
Smith and Robinson.